We got to understand, people, that when you pull $500 billion out of an economy, it's the poor that you doom doing that. Because every economic cost is borne most heavily by the poorest people, always. It's like iron rule of nature and civilization, is that everything that's expensive hurts the poor most. And I'm pretty tired of hearing the environmental activists sacrifice today's real poor to the hypothetically thriving poor of their utopian future. It's appalling morally. And it's not just ignorant, it's darker than that. It's darker than that as far as I'm concerned. We have no right whatsoever to be telling Africans and Indians and Chinese, for that matter, that, well, we're rich and I don't think we'll give it up, rub. But you guys, you should be looking forward to a lot less prosperous future than you might otherwise be. And there's just absolutely no excuse for that whatsoever, especially when we know that if we help the world's poor, or at least got out of their way while they're trying to be rich, that the planet would actually be in much better shape. We could have our cake and eat it too. And your work is so signally important in that regard, and well, hopefully people will wake up and pay more attention to the economists and less attention to the bloody Malthusian biologists.
But there's one thing that is really important for me to make absolutely clear. What I use when I describe them, I very often use also the term working class, but I think I really want also to put it into people's heads. Working class is not the same as poor, right? Many of those farmers in the Netherlands are economically very well off. But what I mean by working class is literally the people who make something work. So those are right, they are the backbone in many ways of the Dutch economy. So they are people that need affordable energy, that produce then food that is affordable, right? So this is what I mean by the working class, and this is also why there is a lot of sympathy towards them in the public. I mean, there was one poll taken, I think it was now 10 days ago, so I don't know the exact numbers, there hasn't been a poll since, but currently the so-called Farmers Citizens Party, which is the political representative of the farmers, has one seat in the Dutch parliament. If elections would have taken place, I think it was July 11th, they would have risen up to 20 seats, and Mark Rutte's party would have lost 14 out of 34 seats. So there is sympathy from the Dutch for the farmers, and it's not just about the farming, it's more a general sense of that this is an attack on what makes us wealthy as a country, right? This is we are, and there's a lot of pride for the Dutch that they feel in the agricultural sector, and they should be, right? You said it before, it's a country the size of a post stamp, and they are an agricultural, animal, livestock farming superpower. It's outstanding. If you look at the research they do, it's what they export in know-how to Kenya, to Indonesia, what they do positive there. But this is all created domestically in this very strong agricultural sector. So just as a concluding remark on this, to give you a good comparison, forcing 30% of Dutch livestock to be abandoned or to basically disappear is similar to going to Silicon Valley and say, so tomorrow you have to close down 30% of all startups. Well, Silicon Valley would still be there, but it probably would be significantly less innovative. And I said this before, this is really my big point is, if you start to hamper and to sabotage an industry that is extremely innovative, at some point they're gonna stop innovating because they're gonna say, first of all, they try to ingrain themselves as the political class to get exceptions so that they can continue farming. And they will tell, this is what some Dutch farmers told me, they tell their children not to take over, their farms.
Well, this is the thing that we really should be aware of here in large part, is that I've watched major companies, corporations, and other enterprises collapse. And they can collapse precipitously because what happens is that when you pressure an industry, all the people that have options leave. And the people who have options are the most competent people. And so if you tell extremely competent and intelligent and sophisticated farmers, because high-producing farmers are all of those things, practical people with a wide range of knowledge and technical ability and mechanical ability and street smarts, all of that. If you say, oh, we're going to make your lifestyle both uncomfortable and then fundamentally unviable, they're going to think, oh, well, guess what? I have better things to do with my time. See you later. And then you lose the best people right away. And as soon as you do that, because a small proportion of people are responsible for almost all the productive effort, as soon as you lose that uppermost echelon, you lose the whole thing. So if we force 30% of Silicon Valley startups to close, or even 10%, all that would happen is all the entrepreneurs would leave Silicon Valley. Like they're leaving California now, for example. They're moving out of California now to places like Tennessee and Texas and Florida. That happens extremely quickly. You cannot pressure competent people because they just tell you to screw off and go do something else. And it's a catastrophe.
It's still going on. I mean, I looked at kind of the most, let's say, pessimistic or let's say anti-farmer news outlets, and even they admit that it has been 25 to 30,000 people, right? The protesters themselves say it's over 40,000, so I think the real number is going to be in between. But there is, again, something I think that's very important for the listeners and the viewers. We're talking about the Netherlands. The Netherlands are usually not a country with mass protest, right? This is ingrained in their political culture. They are very consensus-oriented political nation. This is why also they have many parties in parliament, so there's always a need for consensus. So for them to go onto the streets and, block streets, or the fishermen have blocked harbors, that's a huge thing for the Netherlands. So even if the numbers don't seem that impressive, the fact that it's happening really makes a difference.
Yeah, well, this is worth stressing. I mean, in some ways, there isn't a more civilized country in the world than the Netherlands. And I'm saying that having spent quite a bit of time there and being a great admirer of the Netherlands. But we have to understand is that the Netherlands was taken back from the sea. And that took a lot of effort and a lot of technological innovation over centuries. And so the Netherlands is a very, very well-organized society. It's hyper-productive, it's extremely peaceful, it's consensual, and it's also extraordinarily free. And that's a tremendous number of paradoxical things to get right. And then farmers are not only practical people who don't fly off the handle, but it's also very expensive for them to take their equipment, their heavy equipment, and not utilize it productively and to put it on the streets. And for Dutch to be driven to the point of protest, and then for Dutch farmers specifically to be protesting, if you don't see this as a canary in a coal mine, then you're an idiot. You're willfully blind, fundamentally.
Yeah, and there's more to it. I think this is so kind of the general conversation reporting talks a lot about the nitrogen issue, right? Kind of the environmental part of it. But I think this is something, and this is why you see more and more this all over Europe. It's a little bit of a conflagration that over at least the 90s and early 2000s, there was a growing discontent in the Dutch population, not just about environmental issues and environmental policies, but also about migration, kind of all these issues. And this comes now together because there is, to be very clear here, I'm not sure if that is true. I mean, definitely some of the farmers also believe it. So I cannot speak to the validity of it, but it's something that also raises them emotionally, which is this idea, right, that a lot of the land is, that the government kind of wants to force them off the land, take the land, and then use the land to house migrants. So to what extent that is really true, the evidence is mixed. So there have been one or two cases where these plans exist, but if it's really the main motivation, I have my doubts about this. But the point is, and this goes back to what I said initially, there is a sense in the population that more and more the group of people that is the most important to keep the economy going, to keep the country going, that also preserves the culture and these kind of things, that they're constantly under attack and undermined by the political and particularly also by the cultural elite. And I think this is part of the story of that anger that should not be underestimated. So this is not purely because many of my critics said, oh, Ralph, this is just about nitrogen and that comes from the EU. Yes, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, but there is more going on underneath.
Well, what we could say in regard to that, and I would say this is a reasonable approach from a psychological perspective, is that when you start to use compulsion on people, so compulsion is the sign of bad policy. And so when you start to use compulsion, the judiciary compels the legislative branch, and then the legislative branch compels the farmers, forces them. Well, as soon as you use force on people, you undermine trust by definition, right? Because you don't need to use force on people where there's mutual consensus and trust. So you use force and then you elicit paranoid reactions. It's like if you're going to operate in relationship to me as a tyrant, then just what sort of tyrant are you, and just exactly what you're up to. What are you up to? And so that promotes the spread of these more conspiratorial ideas that might have a toehold in the truth on some fronts, but it's part of a sign of a broader breakdown of communication and trust in society. And that's an absolute catastrophe, because you got to understand this. People have to understand this. A guy named Landis wrote a great book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations about this very factor. He basically claimed, and I think with plenty justification, that the only real natural resource is trust. And that it almost requires a metaphysical miracle to set up a country where the default response from one stranger to another is, well, of course I can shop in your store and you're not going to rip me off. Of course I can buy something online and I'm going to get the product. Of course I can send my kids to schools that the government runs and that'll be fine. It's just a matter of course. That's a miracle. And when you use compulsion in the service of an apocalyptic ideal and undermine that trust, then you generate all sorts of, well, an endless amount of conspiratorial thinking. And that's a catastrophe.
No, I think you touch on something that's extremely important, and that is because, particularly in the trust issue, increasingly, and this I would argue, by the way, happens all over the West. That is not just a Dutch phenomenon, right? That the quote-unquote working class, and if you want to call them the ruling class, we can quibble about this, but they increasingly inhabit completely different moral universes, right? They live in completely different worlds. Exactly what you said, right? The people, as I call them, right, the working people, they want affordable energy, they want good public schools, they want to maintain their cultural and political identity, all these things. And then you have the political class, the academia class, and they have different goals, right? For them, climate change is number one, right? For them, social justice is number one, but it's simply not the same for these other people. And you at some point, you cannot have both of these competing moral priorities in the same country. Like it will come to a head sooner or later. And I think this is what we see in Europe. And to be honest, I think this is just the beginning, right? Because these groundswells have been there, but as long as the economy was more or less working okay, as long as people felt that by the end of the year they were better off than the year before, they were tolerating, the eccentrics of their elites, right? They said, well, those are those eggheads in the universities, and we all know that our politicians lie, but as long as I have access to a better life.
As long as things are working.
Exactly, but once they stop working, and this is so important what you said, because the true test of trust is a crisis. So all these polls were in the past where they said, oh, these are such high trust societies. Well, they were high trust when things were going well. But now we will see how well developed the trust really is if in the fall the worst of the crisis is really gonna hit. And I'm not that optimistic.